Hello, and welcome to Aviation Deep Dive. Germany's World War II bomber fleet has been the subject of a lot of discussion by aviation fans. Relying heavily on medium, twin-engine bombers in the early war, before realizing that some kind of equivalent to carry out strategic bombing was needed, by the time the Heinkel HE-177 came into service, the only real German heavy bomber produced in significant numbers, the aircraft was more of a danger to itself than it was to its enemies, plagued by engine issues, and given the nickname Reichsleiter due to how much of a propensity it had towards fires. This issue primarily stemmed from a systemic bias against heavy bombers that was rampant amongst the ranks of the Luftwaffe, and one that stems back to the 1930s. The subject of today's video, the largely forgotten Dornier Do, is inseparable from these politics. Sporting a 4-engine design, a very interwar mix of the old and new, and crucially designed to carry a large payload deep into enemy territory, the Dornier represented a relatively early look at what strategic bombing would look like during the Second World War. To really understand the story of this aircraft, though, we have to head back to 1936. At this time in German aerospace history, the idea of what was called an Ural bomber had been floating around. Essentially, the concept of a bomber that would be capable of attacking Soviet Union factories in the Ural Mountains from bases in Germany. Being a distance of around 2,700 kilometers or 1,700 miles for a one-way trip, any aircraft that could bring this idea to fruition would have to be a long-range heavy bomber, an idea General Walter Wever was staunchly in support of. Wever, at the time the commander of the Luftwaffe, firmly believed that this concept should be explored, a sentiment that was met with significant skepticism by the Luftwaffe. Nevertheless, Wever was a significant figure, and so in the summer of 1935, was able to formally submit a specification to both Dornier and Junkers, both of whom had already conducted preliminary research into the concept of a Ural bomber, due to the idea being floated around. The specification was quite broad, outlining a bomber capable of carrying a payload of 2 tons over 2,500 kilometers, and of course a smaller payload over much longer distances. Intended to give leeway to the companies to come up with the best design, the Directorate simply outlined an aircraft that would be capable of striking targets in the Ural Mountains from bases in Germany. Initially, these talks with Dornier and Junkers were secretive, as Wever feared that the project would be vetoed by the swathes of officials that thought it was a waste of time. Dornier and Junkers, both happy to sell aircraft, began work on designs nonetheless. Junkers began work on an all-new design for the RLM, but Dornier in fact repurposed a design blueprint that had been floating around their workshop since as far back as July 1933. By late 1935, Dornier had been able to finalize these schematics. This gave Dornier an edge, as they'd been able to progress far faster than Junkers, as a significant amount of the groundwork of their design had already been laid out. Outlining a square fuselage section, mated with a mid-cantilever wing, on which would be mounted 4 radial engines, the aircraft was to be 25 meters in length and 35 meters in span, very large for an aircraft of its time and type. For context, both the B-17 and Lancaster were smaller. The proposed armament, too, was very impressive for the time, with a 7.92mm MG-15 machine gun in the nose and tail positions, with a couple of hydraulically powered turrets on the upper fuselage and belly position, both of which would house 20mm cannons. Interestingly, the proposed top gun turret would be controlled by 2 men, one of which would control the turret's side-to-side movement, and the other would aim the guns in the vertical axis. Throughout 1936, work would begin on constructing the first prototype at Dornier's plant. Dornier did have a history of attempted bomber designs for the Luftwaffe, including the Do-23 in 1934 and the earlier Do-11 in 1932. both of which had been fairly disappointing aircraft and plagued by low performance and reliability issues. The 19, however, was different, as was evidenced by the time it rolled out of its hangar in mid-1936. It bore some design choices that betrayed its lineage of slightly odd-looking interwar bombers, but for being built just 2 years after its bizarre-looking predecessor, the Do-19 was a fairly large step forward. Featuring fully retractable gear, including the tail wheel, which was a bit of a novelty at the time, the aircraft would be crewed by a pretty hefty complement of 9 people, including a pilot, a co-pilot who would also function as the navigator, a bombardier, and 5 gunners. Designated the Do-19 V1, the first prototype would have some differences from the intended design, namely the lack of any armament, and was intended purely to test the flight characteristics of the aircraft. It was also fitted with Bramo 322H2 9-cylinder radials, producing 715 horsepower at takeoff power and 600 horsepower continuous, although it was intended to power the aircraft in future with BMW 132 engines. On October 28, 1936, the enormous aircraft lifted up into the sky on its maiden flight, loaded at 15 tons. The flight went smoothly and without issue, and the aircraft represented docile handling characteristics with no evident issues, which was immediately a step up from its ancestors. The tests revealed that the Do-19 could reach speeds of up to 315 km an hour fully loaded at sea level, but the calculated range was a disappointment at just 1,600 kilometers. Its payload, however, would turn out to be fairly impressive at 1,600 kilograms, certainly more than average for a heavy bomber of the time. Whilst Viva had been watching with interest and the RLM with heavy skepticism, Junkers, who had simultaneously produced a design for the tender, was significantly behind. Their aircraft, dubbed the Ju-89, was not even close to its first flight yet, and even in its early stages of design and construction, it was looking like it'd be significantly more expensive to produce than its Dornier counterpart. The stage was set for Dornier to win the tender easily, and they wasted no time in getting the project moving along as quickly as possible. Construction of V2 followed quickly on from V1, and was intended to be fitted with the full armament and the improved BMW 132 engines, which would up the power to 810 horsepower takeoff and 650 horsepower continuous. However, whilst the armament was being fitted to the half-constructed V2, it was decided to do some static tests, which showed that the fuselage would not be able to take the weight of the proposed dorsal turret. This was a significant blow, as the aircraft's impressive defensive array had been a big selling point of the design. And as the RLM watched on critically, Dornier desperately tried to remedy this with a proposed power plant change. Suggesting Bramo 323 engines, these increased the power output further to an impressive 900 horsepower at sea level, almost 200 more horsepower per engine than the original Bramo 322s. However, the new engine just barely accommodated for the extra weight of the armament, and to actually fit the upper dorsal turret in its intended format, the central fuselage would have to be significantly strengthened and redesigned, a process that would weigh the aircraft down further and delay a time-sensitive project even more. However, 3 months before the aircraft had even taken to the skies, Viva had died on June 3, 1936 in an aircraft crash, and with Viva died any serious hope of either the Dornier or the Junkers entering service. Viva's interest had managed to keep the project alive, whilst almost the entirety of the Luftwaffe had been plainly disinterested in either of them. Although interestingly, the day Viva died, the RLM would issue an updated specification for a heavy bomber, loosely based on the directorate that had produced the Ju-89 and Do-19, which would eventually result in the Heinkel HE-177. Although, with the loss of the main proponent of pure strategic bombing doctrine, the HE-177 project, of course, was soon infected with other ideas that would hamper its capabilities. One such example being the attempt to turn it into a Schnellbomber, or a bomber that was faster than fighters, a decision that resulted in eliminating the normal 4 nacelle arrangement and instead fitting 2 engines in each single nacelle. The idea was a failure. At this point in aviation history, no heavy bomber had a realistic chance of outrunning fighters at virtually any altitude, and the engine arrangement only served to give the aircraft enormous maintenance and reliability issues, as well as an unfortunate trait to randomly catch fire. But, all the way back in late 1936, Dornier had kept working on the aircraft in an attempt to circumvent the issues, but the Eurobomber project simply lost steam without Viva and eventually fell dead in the following months and years. Viva's successor, General Albert Kesselring, argued that the bombing efforts for the upcoming war in Europe should be tactical, not strategic, focusing on ground attack on specific targets to aid ground troops, rather than an extended general bombardment of enemy industry. It was also one of practicality, as in a recorded exchange, Göring had asked Kesselring the question, "How many twin-engined aircraft can we make for each 4-engined one?" To which the reply was, "About 2.5. In response, Göring famously quipped, "The Führer does not ask me how big my bombers are, but how many there are." The lightning tactical attacks with Schnellbombers and Stukas worked well for the Germans initially, but as the war progressed, it became clear there was an element of the game they were simply not playing. Whilst Germany would have constant pressure on her industry throughout the course of the entire war from Allied bombing campaigns, Germany could not really respond in the same sense. Their twin-engine designs flew lower, faster, with smaller payloads to take out tactical targets, and were not suited to the high-altitude mass raids to put serious pressure on a nation's industry. This would have serious consequences later in the war, as the slow loss of aerial superiority rendered their tactical bombers ineffective, and without a significant long-range bomber fleet, they were unable to wage a protracted war. In a letter dated to November 1st, 1942, the president of the Association of the German Aviation Industry would lament in regards to the Dornier and Junker designs that had they been properly developed, both types would have been far superior to all American and English long-range bombers. Rather surprisingly, the Dornier project limped on for nearly a year after Viva's death, completing 83 test flights. Ultimately, the RLM officially terminated Do-19 development since there were no production versions of the bomber planned. This was followed up on April 29, 1937, by the formal cancellation of the entire Eurobomber program. The half-finished V2 and V3 were scrapped, whilst the V1 prototype ultimately got pressed into service as a transport aircraft, and would in fact see service during the German invasion of Poland in 1939. It was ironically the Ju-89 that would see the more success of the two, as further development would lead to the Ju-90, intended for Lufthansa, and then the Tu-90, a long-range maritime patrol bomber of which 65 were produced. The Dornier Do-19, meanwhile, had no such luck, and remains a mere footnote in the history of aviation, a what-if design that ultimately went nowhere, through no fault of its own. A huge thanks to my patrons on screen now for supporting the channel, and thank you so much for watching this video of Aviation Deep Dive. Consider liking and subscribing for more weekly content, and please also consider supporting us on Patreon. See you in the skies.